everybody. Okay, a couple of disclosures to start with. First of all, I'm not a professional trainer. I don't do this for a living, so this is maybe a little bit out of my bailiwick, but I do want to share with you some thoughts and ideas about one aspect of personal leadership called sharpening the saw, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Another disclosure is when Chief of Staff Christy Robbins called me last week and asked if I would do the program, I pretty quickly said yes. I had an opening on my calendar, and early morning like this would work fine with my schedule, and then I started to ask questions after I'd committed to doing it. One of the questions I asked, well, who all has gone through this? Who's doing this program? She told me that the last session was Jack Park. Now, did anybody make the Jack Park session? Okay, a handful of you. Well, that's a tough act to follow. Jack Park's a pretty entertaining presenter. I always wonder, about fact-checking him sometime, I mean, he spouts off statistics about who played what game in 1910 with an ingrown toenail for Ohio State. So, I mean, some of that stuff, you have to just take on faith. But, so anyway, the third thing I want to mention to you as a disclaimer is I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the elements out of Stephen Covey's work, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective Leaders. I'm not a Covey trainer, and all credit for this concept goes to him. It's just some ideas culled out of his book and his work that I think I have found valuable in my career. I'm going to share some of those insights with you, and hopefully you will find some value in them as well. I'm going to try to wrap my comments up in about 35 to 40 minutes, and hopefully allow some time for some good questions, and please feel free to ask questions as we go. So I think it's the best way to start is to kind of talk about the environment that we're all working in and living in today. And I'm going to share with you some things that I think are just some top of mind things about what's going on in our world today and how that's challenging us in our workforces, in our organizations, and in our personal lives. So let's start with this simple statistic that in 1984, not to date myself, but that was about the time I was exiting high school, 2 out of 3 households had school-aged children in them. And those that are in the education business, K through 12 in particular, know that today that number has been inverted, and now only 1 out of every 3 households has school-aged children in them. And so if you talk about, to the education community, about what are some of the challenges in financing public education today, that is one of the headwinds that they're fighting. Sometime next year, half of all children in kindergarten or kindergarten-age children will be in single-parent households. That is a general demographic trend that's happening throughout the country. It may be a little bit different here in Westerville, but nationally that is the trend. Also, the milestones for adulthood are shifting. And I know some of you, like me in the room, have children that are graduating from high school or graduating from college. And, there used to be kind of the typical progression, you graduate from college, you get your degree, and then within a year or two, you're engaged, you got your first job, you're married. A couple years after that, here comes, the first kid or two. And now what's happening is all of those types of trends and milestones are getting pushed. So now the 20s, the age group of the 20s is really kind of becoming what they call emerging adulthood. So a lot of those things that we were conventionally doing in our early to mid-20s are now getting pushed out to late 20s, early 30s as a rule of thumb. Some other demographic shifts. There was a lot of play just in the last couple of weeks about what's happening nationally with our age demographics, and in particular, the boomers, the baby boomers, have been overtaken statistically by the millennials. So the largest population subset in our country now are the millennials, not the boomers. the United States is becoming both grayer and browner. And there was an interesting program put on by the Metropolitan Regional Planning Commission, MORPC, Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission, called MORPC. A couple weeks ago, they brought in a demographer from the University of North Carolina. And he talked about this very dimension here in terms of what's happening with our overall population. And this was a pretty interesting statistic here. 92% of U.S. population growth in the decade of the 2000 through 2010 was non-white. So there's a lot of conversation going on in our political world about erecting fences and the like. But the reality is that most of that population growth was really not from immigration, but it was in reality as a result of what the native population that's already here was doing. And in fact, if you look at the average age of a white female, a non-Hispanic white female in the United States, that average age is about 41 years old, or median age. The median age of a Hispanic female or Latino female in the United States is about 27 years old. So you can see from just a simple age demographic what's happening. If we go ahead and erect this fence, we're still going to see that migration in terms of the growth of the population being in the non-white, non-Hispanic white population. Westerville City School District, approximately 40 languages are spoken in our school district. I went to, my oldest is graduating from Westerville South this year. And we've had several banquets and functions and things like that for different groups that she's involved in. And you look at the program that they put out for these special banquets and things like that and awards events, and I can't pronounce half of the names on the program. I mean, it's really amazing to see the diversity of what's occurring. Another important stat that relates to that is within our school district is 37%, over a third of the school children in our school district receive free and reduced lunches. Is there somebody from the school district here? I didn't recognize anybody. Okay, nobody's here from Westville City Schools. This is a challenge for our school district, and it's a challenge for our community. If any of you are involved with Westerville Area Resources Ministries or WARM, they will tell you that the growth that they have had in this area has been pretty tremendous in terms of trying to serve this population. Our middle class is shrinking. In some cases, some people have made it up to the next tier, but in a lot of cases, folks have dropped out of the middle class and are now in that lower class, entry-level, working class population segment. So we're seeing kind of that division broadening a little bit in terms of the overall socioeconomic status. And we'll talk more about millennials in general, but you know, when many of us, or maybe even our parents' generation, were going into the workforce, what was the mantra that we basically followed? Go find a job. Go where the work is, right? If that meant you had to move 3 or 4 states over, you moved 3 or 4 states over because you went to the work is. Well, what's happening with the millennials today? Millennials today are saying, I want to live there. And when I get there, because they got all the cool stuff there, they got oceans, they got mountains, they've got whatever, they got great coffee shops. I'm going to move there, and then I'll find work when I'm there. So it's a different mentality shift in terms of what people are looking for, what the millennials are looking for. And again, since they are the largest population segment now in our society, that's something we need to pay attention to. One statistic cites that nearly half of all new hires across the board leave within the first year of employment. Now, hopefully not many of our organizations have that kind of turnover, but if you look in areas such as manufacturing, transportation, logistics, retail, for example, they will tell you, yeah, that's absolutely spot on, if not a little generous. And housing preferences are changing. People are wanting to do, they want to be a little bit freer with their housing capabilities. So they want to be able to move. They don't want responsibilities for maintenance. They don't want to have to paint or maintain a house. So the preference for renting versus owning is actually increasing. And what's an interesting substrata of that statistic is we tend to think of that as kind of the younger population set. So maybe it's the millennials that just, that's the lifestyle they want to live. They want to be unencumbered. They want to just be able to do whatever they want to do whenever they want to do it. But what's interesting and what we're finding is that at the top end, there are baby boomers now that are actually starting to say, hey, I don't want the maintenance. I don't want the responsibility. I don't want to be tied to a mortgage. I want to go where my grandchildren are. So we find that a lot of our baby boomers and older generations are actually starting to look at this as a preferred housing option. And of course, technology. Now, I'm gonna make an admission here that I'm not the biggest technology person in the room. I'm not a Luddite, but I'm also not the type of person that has to have every latest new gadget that comes out in every technology realm. But technology is clearly changing how we're working. It's changing how we interface with the working world. I can tell you just in the 8 years that I've been here, we probably have 5 to 7 fewer clerical positions than what we had when I started. And part of that is the fact that we are finding ways to do our work more smartly, more efficiently, using technology that prevents us from having to have a live body pushing paper around. All right, so those are the kind of the cultural societal issues that we're all kind of confronting. And so layer on top of that any number of organizational issues that you're contending with. And I just threw up a small sampling up here, really. I mean, if we went around the room for about 15, 20 minutes, I imagine we could triple or quadruple this list. But these are some things that were top of mind to me in terms of what are the organizational challenges that we all face in our work lives. So we've got these societal and cultural dynamics that are occurring, and then we also have these organizational issues that we're all dealing with. And this makes for managing or leading in today's environment quite the challenge, does it not? So what are we going to do about all that? So what does it mean? It means it's time for us to lead, because we've got to find a way to bridge all these issues in our organizations and move forward. So you want to go ahead and advance?
So we're trading positions.
Okay, that's all right. So leading in this environment is the challenge of the day, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about what are the tools, what are the techniques, what are the different attitudes I think that we need to have in order for us to be able to kind of meet those challenges. And the first is, hopefully this isn't new information, but maybe regurgitating it in a different way for you. Know thyself, and by that I mean. We all have different strengths and weaknesses, we know that. And so in order for you to kind of be able to effectively navigate these changes in the world, you need to know what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, and how do you go about addressing those in your work life. I had an opportunity a couple of years back to participate in an executive leadership program. And they started the whole program with everybody taking the Myers-Briggs test. Who here has taken the Myers-Briggs test? Oh, wow, almost everybody. So you all know your 4-digit code and where you kind of shoot out in terms of are you sensing, feeling, are you introvert, extrovert, all that good stuff, right? So I got to this program the first day, and I walk in the registration, and they hand me this packet, and this is what you'll need for the whole week. So great. On the front of the packet was my Myers-Briggs number, letter, configuration, code, I guess. And they said, you might want to take a few minutes to look at that. There's a detailed report in the back of your folder, but you'll get to that on day 2. So if you want to go ahead and grab the book and look over that description, that might help you as we get into that discussion on day 2. So I look at my code, I go to the book, open up the book, get to the particular one that references my magic code, and I'm thinking, wow, really? Really? Is this me? Gee, okay, all right, well, maybe there's something there that I didn't realize, right? So we get to day 2, where this is the point in the program where we take the deep dive into the Myers-Briggs results. And they said, now, here's your printout sheet. It was in the back of your folder. And you will see on page 2, there's the summary of your conclusions, and there's your actual code. And I looked at the code, and I thought, wait a second. I went back to the thing that they gave me on day 1, and they were different. So I kind of raised my hand and said, what happens if the number on the front of your folder, or the code on the front of your folder, is different than the code that's on the score sheet that's handed out, or the analysis? So the instructor calls me up and looks it over, and she goes, wow, that's a mistake. And so she says, this one on this sheet is correct. Well, it wasn't the one that I looked at. So then I went back and opened up the book, and I started to look at it. It's like, whew. Okay, that's me. So those tools are actually pretty effective. They're pretty accurate, and hopefully those of you that did take it find that there's a pretty good parallel with your own personality. So if you have the opportunity, if you haven't yet, go ahead and take that. I think it's helpful to understand where you are. Debbie? Thank you. Okay. Define your personal and work unit mission, vision, and values. This is kind of basic 101 stuff, but we also, organizationally, hopefully we've all defined organizationally within our own particular workspace, or our particular unit or department, or maybe the organization that we manage. We've done this already, but it helps to do that on a personal level. It's part of that know thyself aspect. Those of you that are familiar with the Jim Collins literature, Good to Great, and that series, he talks about setting these big, hairy, audacious goals, or BHAGs as they're called. I highly recommend the Jim Collins literature, by the way. I think he has also done a really good job of trying to help advance the cause of our organizational life. But this is sometimes easier said than done. And particularly those of us that work in the public sector, which is a certain swath of the audience here, setting these audacious goals sometimes makes it a challenge when you're in the public sector, and that goal-setting process tends to be a very public process. So this can apply to you personally, it can apply to you organizationally. So these are things that you need to be looking at in both contexts. Okay? I'm going to talk more about this in just a minute, but time management is, as we are all very busy. I mentioned to you, I've got one graduating from high school this year. I've got 2 in the queue behind her, and on top of leading the city organization. So managing time is a very critical challenge for me, and I think for most of us. But I'm going to talk about that more here in just a second. And then next, focus on the customer. Hopefully this goes on unsaid, but it's easy for us to get into our routines and our ruts in which we sometimes forget about, why are we doing what we're doing? Why is this important? And so we want to try to clear that clutter a little bit with the focus on the customer. Just a quick story on this, that we just wrapped up at the city. Ryan, you're probably well aware of this. We just did kind of a year-long focus on customer service, okay? And we've been talking about our performance evaluation process and our performance evaluation tool. And we've got all of these measures. We've got a bank of about 15 different measures that we look at. And we finally reached the conclusion at the management team level that that's a little bit too much for the average employee or the average supervisor to try to assimilate for every individual employee. So we are in the process now of actually paring that down, looking at 5 to 7 critical measures that each particular work unit or department or group of employees will be measured against. There is, and we will let the department director choose what those measures are, with one exception. Customer service is going to be the only universal measure that all departments and all employees will get measured against. So I don't care whether you're somebody who is in accounting and you process the payroll, or if you're somebody who patches potholes, or you're in the police department, you're going to get measured on the customer service metric. Okay? Make yourself and what you do essential. That's all about making sure that you continue to provide value to your organization, and that's a brutal assessment sometimes we have to take about ourselves. Is what am I contributing to either the bottom line or to the goals of the organization? All right. And last, reinvest in yourself and sharpen the saw. So let's talk about sharpening the saw. Where does that concept come from? Well, again, I told you at the beginning that I borrowed pretty liberally from the concepts that were pronounced by Stephen Covey. Anybody ever read this book? I was surprised. I went back to revisit it again before doing this and boned up on it a little bit more. But I popped open to the front of it and was surprised to learn that this is a 1989 publication. However, the principles and the concepts in this are pretty timeless, and I think they're pretty spot on. There are 7 different habits that are identified by Stephen Covey, and just go ahead and put them all up there, Debbie, because I'm not going to go through all of those, but I want you to kind of see basically the different aspects of what that publication's about, what Stephen Covey's work is trying to communicate. He looks at things both on an organizational level as well as on an individual level. But what is sharpening the saw about? Well, he uses the analogy of somebody who's been trying to cut down this tree, and he's been working at it for 5 hours and is exhausted, but he's determined and he's going at it, but yet doesn't realize that if he would just sharpen his saw, that work could be done in half the time or less. So what, in the context of that analogy, what is sharpening the saw for all of us? It's about basically it's about honing the tools and creating the tools and refining those tools and skill sets that make us effective in the work that we do. And so, as most of us being in management or leadership positions, those skills a lot of times are soft skills. They're not technical skills, although they may be. But it's about advancing our own professional development. It's about creating new skill sets that meet with what the demands of the current workforce and the current environment are. Debbie? Go ahead. All right, so he talks about, in the book, he talks about 4 different dimensions. And the one that kind of focuses on the most in the conversation is really the mental aspects, although there are physical and social and other elements within this literature. But he really focuses in on the mental. And what is the mental? It's really about a continuous learning aspect. I suspect that since those of you in the room got up a little extra early this morning to be here at 7:30, that you already have a positive disposition towards your own professional development, right? You obviously get that you need to kind of hone your skills, you need to learn more information, you need to be able to interact in the modern workforce. So these 4 dimensions get different treatment in the book, but the mental one is the one I'll focus on here. So what does he talk about in college? He generally talks about the fact that when we go to, there are certain universal laws, and he talks about these different universal laws. But one of the universal laws he talks about is the law of the farm. So when we apply in the context of a college setting, we can sit there in a particular class and we can kind of check out, or maybe we don't even go to class, maybe we don't do the readings, but we get 2 or 3 weeks out before the test day comes, and we cram, right? We pull the all-nighters, we do all of the power reading and all of that. Maybe we go get the Cliff Notes version or whatever. But the law of the farm says that you can't cram. In other words, a farmer knows that if he's going to have a product to harvest in the fall, he's got a certain window of time in the spring that he has to plant by, right? So the law of the farm kind of dictates that we have to kind of take the same approach or the same attitude or perspective in how we kind of manage our own personal lives, because you can't always cram in life, right? You don't always have that ability. And the law of the farm would suggest that we have to kind of do this as we go. It's part of this continuous development, because a farmer can't plant in September and expect to harvest in October. He's got to be ready to go to do the planting in the spring and the tilling and all of that throughout the summertime. So there's stages that we have to kind of go through, and that's really what the law of the farm is about. And so what he's talking about here when he talks about how our mental development occurs is a lot of times we get out of our college environment and we're kind of saying we're into our careers and we get busy, and then we kind of forget about our own continuing development. Go ahead, prompt through that. So we typically do little analytical thinking beyond our own immediate work environment. So when we get home, obviously we've got our own personal lives that we have to deal with. We've got kids, we've got a wife, we've got bills to pay and all of that. And so it's easy for us to kind of get into this living cycle without really taking time out to step back and say, where am I going? Where do I need to be working on my own personal and professional development? And what he finds is that a lot of people, our scope of our intellectual development kind of stops or is stunted after we graduate from college and get into our own work environment. So we talked about the law of the harvest and how we can't do this in our own personal lives. It's not in the end going to serve us well, because you can't do a certain amount of cramming in terms of our own professional development. Okay. The tyranny of the urgent. Those of you that are familiar with the time management quadrant, I'll hit that in just a second, but the tyranny of the urgent is we tend to revolve around dealing with those things that we can kind of immediately deal with, right? So you've got the emails, the never-ending stream of emails. I find that if I wanted to, I could just spend all day reading emails, replying to emails. That is a never-ending process if you don't have some way to kind of quickly deal with them and kind of get through them and get on with the critical work of the day. So this is the time management matrix. You will find it in the 7 Habits book that Covey did. You will find it in a lot of other literature as well. I don't know that this is really necessarily Covey's creation, but he uses this very effectively to kind of talk about what are we doing with our time. So in here you see the 4 quadrants of time use. We can spend time on things that are urgent or not urgent, and we can work on things that are important or not important. And if you do this kind of matrix, you can kind of see where the different activities of our workday fall. And what the goal is ultimately is to try to carve out each day a significant amount of time for those quadrant 2 activities, those things which are important, but they're not urgent. There's no consequence if at the end of one particular day you don't spend time in that quadrant. But there are consequences cumulatively, going back to the law of the farm, cumulatively if you're not spending time in that quadrant, if you're not spending time working on the things that matter, the things that are going to advance the ball, the things that don't have an immediate deadline. And I will tell you that this is, I think, the universal challenge for every leader. It certainly is a challenge for me, because let's face it, at any given day, We have people that are coming in saying, I need to talk to you. I've got an issue I need to bring up to you. We got our meetings, we got email, and so you can get through your day pretty quickly dealing with these things that seem urgent but are either not important or really just are distractions. And so, yeah, I think everybody has to kind of critically look at your work day and your work week and your work life and say, how am I carving out quadrant 2 time? How am I allocating my time to spend in this arena? The things that are truly important, the things that are going to really advance the organization, the goals of the organization, but they may not be necessarily things that, if I don't get done today, are going to have an immediate implication. And by all means, stay out of quadrant 4 if at all possible.
Can we go back?
No, you're fine. That's good. All right. In 7 Habits, there's talk about this responsibility, not responsibility with an I, but responsibility. This was popularized by the work of Viktor Frankl, who was imprisoned during World War II in one of the concentration camps. Viktor Frankl saw most of his family, killed at the hands of their Nazi captors, and he himself was in a concentration camp for an extended period of time. And what Viktor Frankl really kind of did is he kind of said, I can have all of these forces. I can be deprived of my liberty. I can be abused. I can be physically abused. I can be deprived of friendship and contact with people. I can be deprived of basic necessities of life. But what I can't ever be deprived of is my ability to choose how I'm going to react or respond. And so what he kind of popularized in that whole concept was that he can't control the fact that he's in this particular environment, but he can control his response to it. So that's what distinguishes us between the animal kingdom, right? Animals work exclusively on instinct. So there's a stimulus and a response, and that's purely instinctual for the animal kingdom. But we're a little different, and we have that ability to pause between stimulus and response. And so that's the key thing that makes us different from the rest of the animal kingdom. And I think it's also the piece where we have to kind of intentionally look at these quadrant 2 activities and stop and say, where am I going to spend my time? Am I going to do this or am I going to do that? Okay, continue on. So we're talking about just basically leveraging our responsibility to be able to make good choices. All right, go ahead. We'll keep it moving here. So the last thing I really want to touch on, and we'll just kind of open up for conversation and discussion, is so how do you sharpen the saw? What are the things that you do to kind of improve your overall skill set and make yourself a little bit more valuable, maybe a little bit more marketable, however you want to look at it. So you go ahead and put them all up there. And this is a list of about 10 things that I came up with. Again, this is another thing where you could put up any list up there. You could probably double this, if we just kind of went around the room. I want to just highlight on a few things and talk about them because everybody learns differently. Some of us are tactile learners. We like the physical environment. Some of us, can learn from reading. Some of us like to learn from social engagement and talking to other people. But the bottom line is that we have to find those avenues which are going to enable us to do the learning that we need to do to sharpen the saw in our own personal life. So, how many of you are reading blogs or get news feeds every morning, whether that's something as simple as Wall Street Journal or Flipboard or any of those types of news feeds that are going to keep you informed and up to date? We have some great resources right here. I mean, prime example is what you're doing this morning. This is a sharpening the saw activity, and I'd like to acknowledge that Otterbein's really doing a great service to our community by opening this up and allowing people to take part in this. It's a great offering, and unfortunately, you know, too often we ignore those types of resources. Some of you may benefit from finding a mentor. Now that, in a way, is a sharpening the saw activity. I've benefited in my career from having some pretty strong mentors, people that I look back on and think about the difference that they made in my career in terms of being able to help me navigate my early career development. Seminars, conferences, formal training, leadership exchanges. One of the things that's kind of nice about working in the public sector is we are a little less focused on competition and a little more focused on collaboration. So what we have done on a couple of occasions is we will do what we call a leadership exchange. So we will identify other municipalities that we would consider leading organizations. So they're communities that tend to have a reputation for doing things right, doing things well, and then we pair up with them. So we'll spend maybe a day with that organization. This is something that's highly structured, but we identify some areas that we want to talk about. Maybe we're getting ready to do a certain project, and we want to learn. We know that they've done this particular thing before, and they've done it well. We'll spend some time talking about that. But usually it's a group of our executive leadership team, our department heads, and maybe even some of our elected officials. And we'll go and we'll visit that community for about a day. And we also have the opportunity for them to do the flip, that they will come to our organization and learn a little bit about what we do and some of the things that we do well, that we think we do well. Those are very valuable. And I don't know how easy that is to do in your particular realm of work, but those are great ways to try to learn from other organizations. Executive development programs, I was just talking about the one that I participated in. Most of the large MBA types programs throughout the country, those schools a lot of times will, whether it's Harvard or University of Virginia or whatever, a lot of them will host these week-long or 3-day or 2-week types of executive development programs. And those are, if you can swing it, sometimes they're expensive. Maybe your organization can pay for it. Maybe your organization can't pay for it. Maybe they'll just give you the time off. But those are also great ways to help sharpen the saw. In-house corporate academies. We have a program, and in fact, Ryan's a graduate of our leadership development program. It's basically once a quarter. They meet with our training person, our leadership development guru, if you will, and he spends a half a day with that group for 2 successive days. And they're talking, it's basically a complete discussion about different leadership topics, both personal and organizational. If you have those types of programs in your organization, take advantage of them, participate in them. And professional certification programs. I happen to be part of one in my profession in which the very first thing I had to do was I had to take about a 80 or 90 question test. And it basically was testing a whole range of sub-disciplines. So one piece might be on human resources, one piece might be on economic development, another piece might be on financial management. And when the test is done, you get scored on your result of taking the test, and then it kind of populates a little report for you, and it says, here's where you did well, here's where you might need a little bit of focus in your own professional development and career development and education. Again, having that outside kind of neutral third-party evaluation is helpful to kind of help you narrow down what it is you want to focus on. So from that certification program, then we are to take a look at those things every year when we update our plan, our professional development plan. How many of you have a professional development plan that you look at least once a year? Now, maybe you do that in association with your supervisor or maybe you just do it on your own if your supervisor isn't doing one with you. But it's looking each year at what it is that you're going to do in terms of sharpening the saw. Okay. No, you're fine. No, that's good. So here's just here's some of the literature that I think I have benefited from, and you know, where do you start, right? I mean, there's so many resources out there, but I will just tell you that these are some publications that and some authors that I think add value to our understanding of work life and organizational leadership. And then the TED Talks, you know, the nice thing about those is you don't need a half day, you don't need a whole day. What are they? 18 minutes on average. But you can YouTube TED Talks. You can find any subject under the sun, and they're really very well done. And those are ways to try to expand your overall scope of knowledge. Final thoughts. There's a management guru right there, Peter Drucker. You know, only 3 things happen naturally in organizations. Everything else requires leadership, and that's so true. Left to our own devices, sometimes we can get into a period of non-productive activity. Another Jim Collins quote here. And then lastly, this is kind of the essence of sharpening the saw. Elevating our life by conscious endeavor. So to just kind of conclude and wrap it up, hopefully I've just teased some concepts for you. I'm not giving you a prescription. I'm not giving you a program. I do recommend the book, and you can not only learn about sharpening the saw, but the other 6 habits that Covey talks about. And even though that's a 1989 publication, it's pretty timeless. It's pretty relevant. I think you can look at that and you can see, and that's really what Covey focuses in on, is that these are timeless principles. He talks about, you know, things that really focuses on principles rather than just kind of topical issues of the day. So you can really kind of get deep into it. And the last thing I'll say about this is that everything that I've talked about here relative to sharpening the saw is kind of geared a little bit towards the personal level, but a lot of these things apply organizationally. So if you are in a position of leadership in your particular organization, what are you doing to help your people sharpen the saw? What are the programs? What are the professional development activities that you're supporting? We went through a pretty difficult financial situation about 5 or 6 years ago. Of course, this was a national thing. We had a major recession. And a lot of organizations were very challenged financially. What was one of the first things that a lot of organizations did is they cut the training budget, right? Nobody's going anywhere. You know, if you want to advance yourself, go to the library. And I applaud those organizations that did not do that, that said, no, professional development, training, and the building and development of our employees is critical. It's important. We have to invest in our employees because it's absolutely critical to the performance of the organization. There was a particular quote that I like, and that was a discussion that was occurring between a couple of executives about training, about professional development, and one says something to the other about, what if we spend all this money on training and educating our employees and they leave? And the other one says, what if we don't and they stay? So I'll just leave that as a parting thought or shot, and I'll open it up for questions. Thank you.